A loud crash woke up the quiet morning. The windows of the small cabin shook as something heavy hit the porch. A coffee mug fell from the man's hand and broke on the floor, but he didn't care. He ran to the door, heart racing, and opened it. Cold air rushed in. Right there, just past the steps, was a bear, a big mother bear lying in the snow. She was breathing hard, her fur covered in ice and some blood. Her eyes, tired and weak, looked toward the door. Two cubs stayed close to her. They were tiny and shaking from the cold. One cub was limping, barely putting weight on its paw. The other was pressed against its mother's side, trying to stay warm. The mother bear tried to lift her head but couldn't. Her eyes met the man's for a second, and they seemed to ask for help. The cubs made small, sad sounds, their breaths showing in the cold air. The man stood still in the doorway, 1 foot inside, 1 foot out, not sure what to do. He'd never seen anything like this, a dying bear and her cubs right at his house. Snow kept falling, covering the bear's fur with a thin layer. The cubs shook harder, curling up against the cold. The man's breath got stuck in his chest. He looked at the mother bear, barely alive, and her cubs, too small to make it on their own. The moment felt heavy, and the wind blew loud through the trees. The man stood in the doorway, staring at the bear and her cubs. His mind told him to stay back. Wild animals were dangerous, and he didn't know what to do, but his heart wouldn't let him turn away. The cubs were so small, their tiny bodies shaking in the snow. The mother bear was too weak to help them. He couldn't just watch them die. He moved fast, grabbing an old blanket from the couch and a pot of stew left on the stove from last night. The stew was still warm. He stepped outside, his boots crunching in the snow. The cold stung his face, but he kept going. He talked in a low voice, hoping it would keep the bear calm. The cubs didn't run. They were too weak. The mother bear didn't move either, just watched him with tired eyes. He set the pot of stew near her head, close enough for her to smell it. Then he draped the blanket over the cubs. One cub curled up under it right away, tucking its nose into the wool. The other tried to crawl toward the porch but fell in the snow, too tired to keep going. The man's chest tightened. He couldn't leave it there. He bent down and picked up the cub, holding its cold, light body in his arms. Its ribs poked through its fur. He carried it inside the cabin, setting it near the fireplace where it was warm. The wind howled outside, and the snow kept falling. The man looked back at the mother bear and the other cub, still out in the cold. The man stood inside the cabin, the cub in his arms trembling against his chest. The fire crackled in the fireplace, casting a warm glow across the small room. He set the cub down on a rug near the hearth where the heat could reach its tiny body. The cub's eyes were half closed, its breathing shallow but steady. Outside, the mother bear and the second cub remained in the snow. The man's stomach twisted. He couldn't leave them out there, not in this cold. But bringing a full-grown bear and another cub into his home felt like a line he wasn't sure he should cross. He glanced at the cub by the fire. It was already curling tighter into the rug, soaking up the warmth. That decided it for him. He grabbed another blanket from a chair and headed back outside. The wind hit him hard, biting at his exposed skin. The mother bear hadn't moved. Her eyes followed him, but her body stayed still, her chest rising and falling weakly. The second cub was huddled under the first blanket, its small form barely visible. The man knelt in the snow, moving slow so he wouldn't scare them. He draped the second blanket over the mother bear, covering her as best he could. Her fur was stiff with ice, and he could feel the cold radiating from her body. He looked at the second cub, its eyes wide and scared. It didn't try to run, just stared at him. He reached out, his hands shaking from the cold and nerves, and scooped it up. The cub was as light as the first, its body limp in his arms. He carried it inside and set it next to its sibling by the fire. The two cubs pressed close together, their tiny bodies finally still, warmed by the flames. The man stood over them, watching their breathing steady, but his mind was still outside, with the mother bear lying alone in the snow. He went back to the door and looked out. The mother bear was still there, the blanket half buried in fresh snow. Her eyes were fixed on the cabin, on the open door. The man's heart pounded. He didn't know why, but he pushed the door open wider, wide enough for her to see inside, to see her cubs safe by the fire. He stood there, holding the door, waiting. The mother bear didn't move. Her breathing was slower now, each breath a struggle. Then, with a weak push of her snout, she nudged the snow toward the door, as if pointing her cubs to safety. She didn't try to get up. She just lay there, watching the cabin. The man realized then she wasn't coming inside. She had brought her cubs as far as she could, and now she was letting them go. The weight of it hit him hard. He closed the door, his hands shaking, and turned back to the cubs. They were asleep now, their small chests rising and falling in the firelight. The cabin was quiet, but the man's mind was loud with questions. What had happened to the mother bear? Why had she come here, to his doorstep? And what was he supposed to do now, with 2 bear cubs in his home and their mother dying outside? The man sat by the fire through the evening, watching the cubs sleep. He kept the flames high, adding logs when the room started to cool. The cubs didn't stir much, too exhausted to move. He checked on them often, making sure they were warm and breathing. Their fur was starting to dry, and their shivering had stopped. He heated more of the stew and set small bowls near them, hoping they'd eat when they woke. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and broth, but the man couldn't shake the heaviness in his chest. He stepped outside again, pulling his coat tight against the wind. The mother bear was still there, her body half covered in snow. The blanket he'd given her was soaked and useless now. Her eyes were open, but they were dull, no longer tracking him. He knelt beside her, close enough to see the faint rise of her chest. She was still alive, but barely. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't bring her inside. She was too big, too weak, and he didn't have the strength to move her. But leaving her to die alone in the snow felt wrong. He stayed with her, sitting in the cold, his knees sinking into the snow. The wind howled through the trees, and the night grew darker. He talked to her in a low voice, not sure if she could hear him. He told her the cubs were safe, that they were warm and fed. He didn't know why he said it, but it felt like something she needed to know. Her breathing grew slower, each breath farther apart. Sometime in the night, it stopped. The man stayed there a while longer, his hands numb from the cold. The mother bear was gone, her body still in the snow. When he finally stood, his legs were stiff. He went back inside and grabbed a shovel from the shed. The ground was frozen, but he found a spot by the riverbank, under an old pine tree where the snow was softer. He dug a shallow grave, his breath clouding in the air. It took hours, his arms aching, but he didn't stop. He dragged the mother bear's body to the grave and covered her with earth and snow. The blanket went with her, a small piece of his home to mark her resting place. He stood there when it was done, looking at the mound under the tree. The night was quiet now, the wind gone. Back in the cabin, the cubs were awake. They were sniffing at the bowls of stew, lapping at it weakly. The man watched them, his body tired, but his mind racing. They were so small, so fragile. He didn't know how to care for bear cubs, but he couldn't let them die. He decided then he'd keep them alive, at least through the winter. He'd figure out the rest later. The fire burned low, and the cubs curled up together again, their bellies full. The man sat in his chair, staring into the flames, the weight of the day settling over him like the snow outside. The man woke to the sound of soft scratching. The cubs were up, their tiny claws scraping the wooden floor as they explored the cabin. They moved slowly, still weak, but curious. One cub sniffed at the rug by the fireplace, while the other bumped into a chair, letting out a small yelp. The man sat up in his chair, where he'd fallen asleep watching them. The fire had died down to embers, and the room was chilly. He rubbed his eyes and got to work, adding logs to the fire until the flames roared again. The cubs turned toward the heat, their small bodies drawn to it. He checked their bowls from the night before. They'd eaten most of the stew, leaving only a few bits of meat stuck to the sides. He heated more food, this time mixing in some milk from his pantry to make it easier for them to eat. The cubs watched him, their dark eyes following his every move. When he set the bowls down, they waddled over, noses twitching, and started lapping at the mixture. The limping cub moved slower, favoring its injured paw, but it ate just as eagerly as its sibling. The man knelt nearby, watching them eat. Their fur was cleaner now, less matted, and their ribs didn't stick out as much. They were still tiny, but they were alive. The man spent the day tending to them. He cleared a corner of the cabin, laying down old blankets to make a soft spot for them to sleep. He moved anything breakable, dishes, tools, a lamp, to higher shelves, knowing the cubs would get stronger and more curious. He checked the limping cub's paw, gently holding it while it squirmed. The paw was swollen but not broken, maybe sprained from whatever had happened to them in the woods. He wrapped it in a strip of cloth, hoping it would help. The cub didn't like it, but didn't fight much, too tired to resist. Outside, the snow kept falling, piling up against the cabin's walls. The man looked out the window at the pine tree where the mother bear was buried. The mound was already covered in fresh snow, blending into the ground. He felt a pang in his chest, thinking of her out there, alone. But the cubs were here, and they needed him. He didn't know much about bears, but he knew they couldn't survive the winter on their own. He'd have to keep them fed, warm, and safe until spring, when they might be strong enough to leave. The man went to his pantry and took stock. He had enough food for himself: canned beans, dried meat, some oats, but not much for 2 growing cubs. He'd need to ration carefully and maybe hunt or fish if the snow let up. He found an old book on wildlife in a drawer, something he'd picked up years ago but never read. He flipped through it, looking for anything about bear cubs. It said they needed lots of food, especially fat and protein, to grow strong. It also said they could get attached to humans if raised by them, which might make it hard for them to go back to the wild. The man closed the book, unsure what to think. He'd deal with that problem later. By evening, the cubs were more active. They wrestled with each other, tumbling over the blankets, their small growls filling the cabin. The man watched them, a faint smile on his face. They were tougher than they looked. He decided to call them Ash and Ember, after the grey and reddish patches in their fur. The names felt right, like they carried a piece of their mother's strength. As night fell, the cubs curled up together in their corner, exhausted. The man sat by the fire, the book still in his lap, listening to their soft breathing. The cabin felt fuller now, less empty than it had in years. Days turned into weeks, and the man settled into a routine with Ash and Ember. He woke early each morning to stoke the fire and heat food for the cubs. They grew fast, their bodies filling out, their fur thicker and shinier. The limping cub's paw healed, and it scampered around the cabin with its sibling, chasing shadows and wrestling over scraps of blanket. The man built a low barrier around their corner to keep them from wandering too far, but they still found ways to cause trouble. Once, Ember knocked over a stack of firewood, scattering logs across the floor. Another time, Ash climbed onto a chair and got stuck, crying until the man lifted it down. Feeding them was the biggest challenge. The cubs ate more every day, and the man's pantry was running low. He started fishing in the river when the weather allowed, bringing back small trout to boil into a broth the cubs loved. He hunted once, dragging back a rabbit, but the cubs were more interested in playing with the bones than eating the meat. He laughed for the first time in weeks, watching them bat the bones across the floor. The book had been right. They needed fat. He melted down what little butter he had and mixed it into their meals, watching their energy spike after each feeding. The man learned their habits. Ash was bolder, always the first to explore or try something new. Ember was quieter, sticking close to its sibling, but quick to steal food when Ash wasn't looking. They followed him around the cabin, their claws clicking on the wood, and slept at his feet when he sat by the fire. He tried not to get too attached, knowing they'd have to leave eventually, but it was hard. Their big eyes and clumsy movements made the cabin feel alive, like it hadn't in a long time. Winter grew harsher. Storms rolled in, piling snow up to the windows. The man kept the fire burning day and night, using up his woodpile faster than he'd planned. He went out to chop more when he could, his breath freezing in the air. The cubs stayed inside, growing restless. He made toys for them, old rags tied into knots, a wooden spoon they could chew on. It kept them busy for a while, but they were getting stronger, and the cabin was starting to feel small. One night, during a bad storm, the man sat up late, listening to the wind rattle the windows. The cubs were asleep, sprawled across their blankets, their paws twitching as they dreamed. He opened the wildlife book again, reading about how bears survive in the wild. It said cubs usually stayed with their mothers for 2 years, learning to hunt and find shelter. Ash and Ember were nowhere near ready for that. They relied on him for everything: food, warmth, safety. The man closed the book and stared into the fire. He didn't know if he was doing the right thing, raising them like this. What if they couldn't survive on their own? What if they got too used to him and never left? The storm passed by morning, leaving the world outside quiet and white. The man took the cubs to the door for the first time, letting them sniff the cold air. They stepped onto the porch, their paws sinking into the snow, and looked around with wide eyes. They didn't go far, just tumbled around the steps, before scurrying back inside to the fire. The man watched them, his chest tight. Spring was still months away, but it was coming. He'd have to start thinking about what came next, for him and for Ash and Ember. Winter dragged on, and the man worked hard to keep Ash and Ember healthy. The cubs were growing bigger, their bodies rounder, their claws sharper. They no longer fit in the corner of the cabin, so the man moved their blankets closer to the fireplace, where they sprawled out at night, snoring softly. Their appetites were huge now, and the man struggled to keep up. His pantry was nearly empty, and the river was frozen over, making fishing impossible. He relied on what little he had left: oats, a few cans of beans, and the last of his dried meat. He mixed everything with melted fat from a deer he'd hunted before the worst storms hit. The cubs ate it all, licking the bowls clean. The man spent his days tending to them. He brushed their fur with an old comb to keep it free of tangles, checked their paws for cuts, and played with them to burn off their energy. Ash loved to wrestle, pouncing on the man's boots and tugging at his sleeves. Ember was less rough but quick to join in, nipping at Ash's ears. The cabin was a mess of scattered blankets and chewed-up rags, but the man didn't mind. The cubs brought noise and life to the quiet space, and he found himself laughing more even when they knocked over his chair or stole his socks. He started taking them outside more when the weather wasn't too harsh. The cubs loved the snow, rolling in it and digging with their paws. They chased each other around the porch, their breaths puffing out in clouds. The man watched closely, making sure they didn't wander too far. He showed them how to dig under the snow for roots, copying what he'd read in the wildlife book. Ash caught on fast, shoving its nose into the ground and coming up with bits of frozen grass. Ember was slower, more interested in batting at snowflakes. The man hoped these small lessons would help them later when they had to survive on their own. The nights were long, and the man often stayed up, reading the wildlife book by firelight. It said bear cubs needed to learn how to find food, climb trees, and avoid danger. He tried to teach them what he could inside the cabin. He stacked chairs for them to climb, hid food under blankets to make them search, and rolled a ball for them to chase. Ash and Ember treated it like a game, but the man knew it wasn't enough. They needed the wild, not a cabin. He started to worry about spring. The cubs were strong now, but they were still young, and he wasn't sure they could make it without him. One morning, the man found tracks in the snow outside the cabin. They weren't from Ash or Ember. Too big, too deep. Another bear had been nearby, maybe drawn by the smell of food. The man's stomach tightened. He kept the cubs inside that day, watching the woods through the window. The tracks didn't come back, but they reminded him of the world waiting outside. Ash and Ember weren't safe here forever, and neither was he. He started planning for spring, thinking about where he could take them, somewhere far from other bears and people, where they could learn to be wild. The man also noticed the cubs were changing. They were less clingy, more independent. Ash would wander to the door and paw at it, wanting to go out even when it was storming. Ember still stayed close but didn't follow the man as much, preferring to nap by the fire. They were growing up, and the man felt a mix of pride and sadness. He'd saved them, but soon he'd have to let them go. He looked at the pine tree outside, where their mother was buried, and wondered if she'd known this day would come. Spring came slowly, the snow melting in patches, the river starting to flow again. The man felt the change in the air, warmer and softer. Ash and Ember were almost too big for the cabin now, their shoulders brushing against the furniture when they moved. They were stronger, their movements sure and quick. The man knew it was time to prepare them for the wild. He started taking them farther from the cabin into the woods where the trees were thick and the ground was soft with new grass. He showed them how to find food in the forest. He dug up roots and pointed out berries starting to grow on low bushes. Ash was eager, sniffing everything and digging with its claws. Ember followed but got distracted, chasing bugs or rolling in the dirt. The man let them explore, staying close but giving them space. He watched how they moved, how they reacted to sounds, a bird calling, a branch snapping. They were curious but not afraid, which worried him. The wild was full of dangers they didn't know yet. The man built a small shelter in the woods, a lean-to made of branches and bark, where the cubs could rest during their trips. He brought them there every few days, letting them get used to the forest. Ash climbed the trees around the shelter, its claws digging into the bark. Ember stayed on the ground, sniffing the air. The man sat nearby, watching them, his heart heavy. They were learning, but it was slow, and he wasn't sure if he was teaching them the right things. The wildlife book didn't tell him how to say goodbye. Back at the cabin, the cubs were restless. They paced by the door, scratching at it, wanting to be outside. The man let them out more, sometimes all day, but always brought them back at night. He wasn't ready to let them go completely. He started leaving food outside, under the porch, to get them used to finding it on their own. Ash found it first, dragging the scraps into the snow. Ember joined in, and soon they were eating without the man's help. It was a small step, but it felt big. One day, the man took them to the riverbank, near the pine tree where their mother was buried. The cubs sniffed the ground, their noses lingering over the spot. They didn't dig or paw at it, just stood there, quiet. The man watched, his throat tight. He didn't know if they remembered her, but it felt like they did. He sat with them for a long time, the river gurgling nearby, the sun warm on his face. The cubs lay down, their bodies touching, and the man felt a strange peace. They were almost ready. As the days grew longer, the man made a plan. He'd take Ash and Ember deep into the forest, to a place he'd found with plenty of water and food. He'd stay with them for a while, make sure they could climb, forage, and hide. Then he'd leave them, little by little, until they didn't need him anymore. The thought hurt, but he knew it was right. They weren't his to keep. They belonged to the wild, like their mother had. The man packed a bag with food, a knife, and the wildlife book, ready for the trip. He looked at Ash and Ember, sleeping by the fire, their bodies big and strong. They weren't the tiny, shivering cubs he'd found months ago. They were bears now, almost ready for the world. The man sat by them, his hand resting on their fur, and watched the fire burn low. Tomorrow, he'd start letting them go. The man led Ash and Ember deeper into the forest, his bag heavy with supplies. The air was warm, the ground soft with new grass and mud. The cubs bounded ahead, their strong legs carrying them over roots and rocks. They were bigger now, their fur thick and glossy, their eyes bright with curiosity. The man had chosen a spot miles from the cabin, a valley with a clear stream, dense trees, and bushes heavy with berries. It was far from other bears and people, a safe place for the cubs to learn the wild. For days he stayed with them, sleeping in the lean-to he'd built. He showed them how to fish in the stream, pawing at the water like he'd seen in the wildlife book. Ash caught a small fish on the second day, shaking it proudly in its jaws. Ember was slower, but learned by watching its sibling. The man pointed out edible plants, tearing leaves for them to sniff and taste. The cubs ate eagerly, their bellies full of berries and roots. They climbed trees, chased squirrels, and dug dens in the soft earth, their instincts waking up. The man watched them grow bolder. Ash wandered farther each day, sniffing out new paths. Ember stayed closer, but explored on its own, no longer glued to its sibling's side. They still came to the man at night, curling up near him in the lean-to, but they didn't need his warmth anymore. He started leaving them alone for hours, hiding in the trees to see what they'd do. They foraged, played, and rested, unaware of his eyes on them. They were learning to be bears. One morning, the man packed his bag and walked them to the stream. He sat by the water, the cubs splashing nearby. He didn't call them over, just watched. Ash climbed a tree, its claws gripping the bark. Ember nosed through a bush, pulling out berries. The man stood, his bag over his shoulder, and started walking back to the lean-to. The cubs didn't follow right away. They looked up, saw him leaving, and went back to their play. The man's chest ached, but he kept going. He stayed in the valley one more night, sleeping alone in the lean-to. The cubs didn't come back. He heard them in the distance, their grunts and rustles carrying through the trees. At dawn, he walked to the stream again. Ash and Ember were there, drinking water, their fur wet from the morning dew. They saw him and ambled over, nudging his legs with their noses. He knelt, running his hands through their fur, feeling their strength. Then he stood and walked away, not looking back. This time, they didn't follow. The man returned to the cabin, the silence heavy without the cubs. He cleaned the blankets, put away the bowls, and swept the floor, erasing the marks of their stay. But the cabin didn't feel empty. It held the memory of Ash and Ember, of their mother's last moments in the snow. He walked to the pine tree by the riverbank, where she was buried. The ground was green now, dotted with wildflowers. He sat there, the river flowing nearby, and thought of her eyes, trusting him with her cubs. Every spring after that, the man saw Ash and Ember again. They came to the riverbank, grown now, their bodies heavy and strong. They didn't approach the cabin or look for food. They just stood by the pine tree, sniffing the ground where their mother rested. The man watched from a distance, hidden in the trees. They stayed a while, then turned and disappeared into the forest. Each year they came back, and each year the man felt the same quiet pride. He'd opened his door to a dying bear and her cubs, and in return they'd given him something to carry forever, a reason to keep going. Show in Sidebar.